Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a really big one of the world's most enduring and complex disputes, the status of Tibet. We're going to use research and historical analysis to really get to the core of this conflict.
So is Tibet an independent nation or is it part of China? At the heart of everything, you have two totally different answers to that one question. And we're not just talking about modern politics here. These are answers that are deeply rooted in centuries of history, culture, and competing ideas of what it even means to be Tibetan or Chinese.
So to really get a grip on what's happening now, we have to look back, way back. You'll see that this whole dispute is basically built on two competing stories about the past, and they couldn't be more different.
All right, and here's where those two stories just completely diverge. On one side, you have China's claim. They say, look, Tibet has been part of China since the 13th century Yuan dynasty. It's a story of historical unity. But then you have the Tibetan claim, which says, hold on a second. Yes, they were both under the Mongol Empire, but they weren't the same thing. And later on, with the Qing dynasty, they describe it as a priest-patron relationship. Basically, spiritual guidance in exchange for protection. It was a partnership, not a takeover.
And that brings us to a huge turning point. In 1912, the Qing dynasty collapses. For Tibet, this was their moment. According to their own historical accounts, they kicked out all the Chinese officials and declared full independence. And for nearly 40 years, they acted like it. They had their own government, their own money, the whole shebang.
So if you look at this timeline, you can really see those two competing stories playing out. You've got the early unified Tibetan Empire. Then that super controversial period under the Mongols, which leads to that 1912 Declaration of Independence. And that status quo holds for decades, right up until 1950. That's when everything changes. The People's Liberation Army of China invades. And suddenly, this historical debate isn't just a debate anymore. It's a military conflict.
Okay, so that 1950 invasion leads directly to what we're about to talk about next. It's a document that is, even today, maybe the most controversial piece of this entire puzzle, the 17-point agreement.
So what happened was this. After the Chinese army moved into eastern Tibet, a group of Tibetan delegates were brought to Beijing. And there they were handed this document. It was called the Agreement on Measures for the Peaceful Liberation of Tibet. And with the very real threat of a full-blown military invasion hanging over their heads, they signed it.
So what was in this thing? Well, it was kind of a deal, on paper at least. The big one was that Tibet would formally return to the motherland, meaning become part of China. But in exchange, China made some pretty big promises. They promised regional autonomy, that the existing political system and the Dalai Lama's position wouldn't be touched, and that religious freedom would be respected.
But here's the legal bombshell. From the Tibetan perspective, and according to a lot of international legal experts, that agreement is completely invalid. Why? Because of a legal concept called duress. It basically means you can't be forced to sign a contract with a gun to your head. And the argument here is that the Tibetan delegates had no other choice. It was either sign the paper or face a massive military invasion. Not much of a choice, right?
Well, those promises in the agreement, they didn't last long. Things got more and more tense until 1959, when it all just exploded into a huge uprising against Chinese rule. The uprising was crushed, and the Dalai Lama had to flee for his life to India. It was from there that he established a government in exile, making it clear that in his eyes, and in the eyes of his people, they were still the legitimate government of Tibet.
After 1959, everything shifted. We're now in a totally new reality. The sources and research we're looking at describe a really systematic, multi-pronged effort by China to fully integrate Tibet and lock down its control for good.
Now, some of the research uses a pretty powerful term to describe what's happened since modern colonialism. And what they mean by that isn't just old-school empires. It's a modern playbook. Total political control, yes, but also exploiting the region's resources and actively pushing the native population and their culture to the margins.
So how does this actually work in practice? Well, according to the research, it's a four-part strategy. First, you rewrite history to make your claim look stronger. Second, you use securitization. That means you frame any expression of Tibetan culture or identity as a security threat, a form of separatism, to justify cracking down. Third is that political and economic control we just talked about. And fourth, you wrap it all up and sell it as creating a new era of unity and prosperity, which often just means cultural assimilation.
And what does that look like on the ground for everyday Tibetans? Politically, it's total control by the Chinese Communist Party. Economically, it means resources like minerals and water are taken out of Tibet, with very little of that wealth staying in the community. But maybe the biggest impact is social and cultural. You have state-sponsored migration of Han Chinese into the region, which threatens to make Tibetans a minority in their own homeland. In schools, Mandarin is pushed over the Tibetan language, and religious freedom is, well, it's heavily curbed.
Okay, so all of this brings us right back to the central legal and philosophical idea at the heart of this whole thing today, the right to self-determination.
What is self-determination? It's a huge principle in international law. It basically says that a people, a group with a shared history, culture, language, has the right to freely choose their own political status without anyone else telling them what to do. And what's really interesting is that the UN actually passed resolutions back in the 1960s that specifically mentioned this right for the Tibetan people.
But as you can probably guess, that's not how China sees it. Their official line is that Tibet is purely an internal matter, so any talk of self-determination isn't seen as an international right. It's framed as separatism, a dangerous threat to the unity of the country. And this complete clash of views, as the research points out, makes it pretty much impossible for Tibetans to actually exercise that right.
And that leaves us with a pretty tough final question, one that comes straight from the analysis. When you look at the current political reality, at China's power on the world stage and its firm stance, is Tibetan freedom, as one source puts it, just unrealizable wishful thinking? What does the future hold for Tibet's very distinct identity and for the dreams of its people? There are no easy answers here, in a conflict that's just as much about history as it is about the future.